Opening government, Mr. Speaker.
Hi, Bill.
Opening office, Mr. Speaker.
Oh,
Standing W.
sorry.
CG.
I'm sure.
CO.
Winsky.
Are we good? All good? Let's go. We have a motion this House believes that genetic research should exclusively be done by the state. To start off the debate, calling on the Honorable Prime Minister, please.
Madam Chair, since time immemorial, we see that there has always been effort to maintain the delicate balance between capitalism and also socialism, and any kinds of effort to ensure that corporations that are inherently profit-driven, that are inherently have that drive to always make as much money as possible, prevail within our society. But as time goes on, we see how there has been a lot of effort to justify the making of money, because at the end of the day, since money is the reason why the world goes round, and that is the reason why we should give this ability to the corporation. We think that when it comes to things that affect humanity, things that affect human life, things that affect the quality of the way you live, we think that this thing should lie in the hand of the government to begin with, within the hand of the state to begin with. Before we go with my arguments, let's look at the very first problem, right? When we're talking about genetic research, oftentimes we are talking about how this research are oftentimes as the idea suggests, it is something that is related to genetic, means that it modifies life before existence, be it human, be it animal, but we think that the main focus here should become about humanity to begin with, right? But the problem here is that it leads to a lot of problems, like for example, design babies, where probably you would design, instead of supermodels, you design hypermodels or probably ultra models with enhanced beauty or probably gallantry, so that at the end of the day, any kinds of, you reinforce the idea of what is beauty to begin with. But second and most importantly, we might be able go to the point where we are creating people who are inherently super strong, to the point where we are creating super soldiers to begin with. And the stance of the side opening government is simple. We believe that because we have the ability to go to that point, then this power shouldn't be within the corporations, it should be within the hands of the government, because it is always about the interest of the people at the end of the day. What is this debate about, right? We think this debate is about the research, but at the end of the day, the moment in which we have done the research, then the government is going to patent this kind of research. The patent is going to be owned by the government, meaning to say that if there is any corporations that want to go on further with this, then the corporations need to get approval from the government to go with the patenting, and we think that approval is not going to be something that is going to be given willy-nilly, like you buy probably bread or things like that, and then the government, then there's going to be a lot more ways, a lot more procedures that entail the giving up or probably the outsourcing of that patent to corporations to begin with, right? But before that, let's look at a few vital characterization, right? What is the qualifier for something to be given exclusively to the state, right? First and foremost, it should be within the hand of the state when it is for the public good, but it could also become a public harm. Secondly, we think that in the event where the state has all the infrastructure, but also has the ability to to develop the infrastructure, this is the moment in which we should give it to the state to begin with. But thirdly, and the most importantly, where the issue is not only going to be national, but it could also cause international urgency or international issues, like for example, the development of nuclear weapon, then that is exactly the reason why this should be within the hands of the state. That is the reason why we don't allow any corporations to create their own nuclear bomb, because just because we know that corporations have the ability to do that, it should always be within the hands of the state, because we think that the states are always bounded by a lot of international treaties and international laws. These are the kind of things that are always like keeping states and also like governments in check, and also always ensure that they are behaving within a standard international behavior, right? So what we are going to prove here, we are going to win this debate where if we manage to prove that state has better accountability, and what private actors will insidiously use this for their own good, like for example, the development of profit, for the creation of profit, etc. Sure.
Can you explain why the profit incentive leads to the egregious harms you accuse companies of?
Okay, that is going to be my second argument. Okay, so let's look at the first problem, right? First argument. What are we okay with, right? We are okay with researchers done openly, right? Because oftentimes we see in the status quo a lot of researchers done openly, where the publication is going to be made public, where academics and also like students in university and all that get this publication, get better access to this publication to begin with. This means that even in the status quo, transparency and accountability is already there. This means that a state will always have to like adhere to that standard of research to begin with. But even if it is an issue of national security, right? We think that there is always a check and balance within the government, or within the structure of the government. Like for example, when we're talking about projects like the Manhattan Project, right? First and foremost, they are recruiting scientists and also a lot of like manpower that are oftentimes going to be a valuable addition to this kind of project. What do we mean by this? First and foremost, recruitment will always work on the basis of choice, meaning to say that if they know that this is going to lead to harm eventually, then they could always say no. And therefore, if the scientists cannot like, if the scientists are not going to like go in, they are still not going to be able to go even further. But even they cannot choose to not consent, we think that the government always know best, right? Because like at the end of the day, they are always voted by the people and they hold mandate of the people, and at the end of the day, anything that they wanted to go on even further is always going to be about the interest of the people. And also, like more importantly, right, at least we think that, so the conclusion here is that the accountability exists, because at least the government will always use it for the betterment of the people, and for the betterment and also the state, because the enrichment of the state means that we're enriching the people as well. Like for example, as much as I really hate to admit this, like for example, when we're talking about things like the war in Iraq, even though it is something that is so bad for the people in Iraq or probably Afghanistan, at the end of the day, this has always been about the interest of the people in America. It is always about the interest of the people within that state. So assuming that the best that we can achieve from that war is that in hindsight, we would be able to like go on with that war without even having to kill all these people out to begin with. And therefore, it is always for the benefit of the people, and we are okay with this kind of stuff. But second and most importantly, right, let's look at another thing, right? Oftentimes, like this research always trickle down to the people. Like for example, the development of internet, the development of microwaves that are oftentimes funded by the military and things like that, right? So then at the end of the day, this goes back to the mechanism like that we have stated earlier just now, where, you know, like the moment in which the government has control over this, then this means that if corporation wants to adopt this technology or probably this research to begin with, then they would have to give money for the patent. I don't know why you said like, I don't think that it is already 6. But yeah, by the way, like the money is going to go to the government in the form of tax money, and therefore like the money is always going to go back to the government and also going to go back to the people at the end of the day. Is it really already 7?
Yes.
Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, all right. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, to open this conversation. LO, please.
Okay.
You consent this live stream, right?
That is the shortest 7 minutes in my life. Oh, okay.
It is rather unclear to me as to what are the inherent bad research that a private company will undertake and what are the inherent good research that a government will undertake on their side. So I'm going to do two things in my speech. The first is going to talk about why the state acting exclusively is often a bad actor. And secondly, I'm going to talk about why there is an urgency for us to allow the maximum amount of involvement in genetic research through involving private companies. But before that, just a couple of responses that didn't fit in, if I'm correct about it. They said that private companies, part of their endeavor is to create designer babies and super soldiers, I think. So a couple of questions here. A, why are these things inherently bad? Two, if these things are inherently bad, why don't you just ban certain practices of gene editing as opposed to banning private companies altogether from undertaking gene editing? Lastly, this is not the vast majority of research that private companies undertake. Like through, for example, the technology of CRISPR, they are trying to find genetic ways to cure cancer and stop the inheritance of diseases and so on. So I don't know why these are the particular harms that they're talking about. But also, if there is some militaristic capability, then obviously the state is the one that's going to exploit this the most, right? That issue is going to be a wash. Whether private companies create it or the state creates it, either way, those soldiers are going to exist, and it's going to hurt people. Also, on the accountability for the betterment of the people, we would argue that both the state and the private companies both have an incentive to better the lives of people. Just one is for votes, the other is for money. The question is who has the greater capacity to actually fulfill those promises. We would argue that private companies have that greater capacity. In fact, when private companies work with the state as well, their capacity can significantly increase. Lastly, this idea of the consent of scientists, I don't think that's mutually exclusive. So the first, why the state acting exclusively is a bad actor. There are several reasons for this. The first is about political will. So by fiat, perhaps they can assume that the state will embark on this research and will do some of this research, but it's unlikely that this department or this research will continue to exist in the way it exists now for a very long time, or it would even get the funding it needs to be able to do its job effectively. Why is this so? Because often science departments within the state is often the most vulnerable to funding cuts, right? Anytime there is a recession or you need to reallocate money somewhere, you're going to cut from the science departments. The same way Trump remove funding for the EPA in status quo. Secondly, often these are also departments that are just by virtue of it being a state department, it's also subject to religious lobbying. So in the sense that genetic research directly contradicts the interests of your religious groups because you're interfering with God's work, then there is less of a reason for politicians to want to give money to these areas to continue funding these areas, right? Because it's just dangerous to your religious lobby. In contrast, of course, I think investors are very much capable of giving seed funding to a lot of private companies to start up genetic research, and there are already pre-existing lots of pharmaceutical companies that have lots and lots of money for R&D to exist in order to continue this research, right? So I think in comparison, given that the political will to put money in genetic research is lower with governments, but generally higher with private companies, we think that more efficiency is with private companies. Secondly, states don't operate in competition. What this means is that often they have no incentive to innovate, no incentive to invest further in better practices or practices that are likely to create higher efficiency, right? This means that you are likely to see the ideas of bureaucracy, the ideas of state incompetence just seeping into those same departments because they are managed in a way that just allows them to exist as a tokenistic faction of the state. And if there's relatively low pressure, in fact, if people don't look at the government and says, please give me genetic research, because that's never on the top priority of their list, they are single issue voters on completely different reasons, then the state has no incentive to be pressured to continuously provide good research in this area. Next is about talent and expertise, right? I think often the state is bad at retaining talent and expertise because they don't pay them much. Additionally, if you have an entire industry of bioscience research just completely wiped out, the idea of people studying it just to join the government or the civil service is quite ludicrous. So I think you have a significant reduction in the amount of talent and expertise that goes into genetic research, or people actually studying or going further in their education on genetic research. Additionally, they can't do things like undertake joint ventures as well, right, with private companies, because these are often great ways in order for you to further finance and create intergovernmental knowledge sharing in order to significantly increase the amount of wealth different companies can have in order to further expand their genetic research. Lastly, let's talk about intellectual property here, because I think what the advantage that perhaps private companies might have is that they get to copyright whatever research that they have. But often these copyrights are not for long. They often, in most countries, they're like 15 years, right? What this means is that even though it's for 15 years, they are likely to be better than the state nevertheless, because you have the certainty of operation, and B, you know that in those 15 years, the state wouldn't have done anything themselves because they lack the experts and the resources to do the same things. Azim.
So what stops certain pharmaceutical companies from just patent trolling to ensure that these products can never harm their own businesses?
They might not. There probably isn't much patent trolling like mechanisms right now. We can instill those mechanisms. They are doing those things. But I think in the comparative, they still have more of an incentive or better capacity to do so. So on the next point of urgency, I think it's crucial that we understand what are the real reasons as to the real benefits from genetic research. These are things like gene therapy, gene editing to prevent the chromosomal defects that exist in babies that make them born into lives that are a lot less comfortable. This means that the inheritance of diseases like HIV from mother to child, like cancer treatment that's involved often with genetic research. I think that the point here is that often people live really uncomfortable lives, or even to the extent of dying at a very early age. If you're talking about things like cystic fibrosis, we would argue that speed is morally imperative. Meaning, if you're going to significantly slow down, no, thank you, out of order. If you're going to significantly slow down the amount of research that can be undertook by the state because they are not being able to work with private companies, and there's less private companies, those pressure to do so, I think you're also significantly reducing the amount of benefits that is critically needed for these individuals at that point in time, right? We think the state should not limit entities from their ability to prolong life or give any treatment to people, because that should be the inherent right of individuals to expect from private entities. If those private entities fuck up, then you can just, sort of sue them, but banning them is just kind of drastic. Happy to oppose.
Thank you, DPM, please.
Honorable Chair, Martin Shkreli was made CEO. Martin Shkreli ensured that EpiPen, the product that would save and protect the lives of millions all around America, would be sold at $5,000. This is because these people can't survive without it. This is because these people are desperate and will always buy them no matter what. He ensured to target the rich and only the rich because it will benefit the most, and refused to lower the prices for the poor to be able to have access. The same happened with HIV pills all around the world. The same happened with corporations always seeking profits because they want to make the most ROI out of their products. We tell you, the comparative isn't just that the government can perhaps do less work. We still don't see why this is true, or why exactly all the argumentation or the government bureaucracy is likely to be true. There's no incentive for the government to do so. Even then, the government always has an incentive to ensure that it has the best research possible, because it can ensure that the benefits flows then towards the government themselves, and ensures that the benefits can then be sold off to corporations. That's really what they want to argue later on. But even then, we tell you that if their argumentation and answer to my POI was just we'll have regulations, somehow they still have the fiat, then we think it's fair that we have that fiat too. We have that fiat that the government is willing to invest within these things, the government is willing to do so. Ideal told you the comparative of most government researchers that does attempt to gain the best experts available. But even then, we still have the abilities for us to have that joint ventures. States don't work in a vacuum. States work together. Your NASA will always still work with the European Space Agency and does work with the Russian and Chinese Space Agency. All these agencies can still work together and have international discussions and intra-national discussions, all of which can still work. The ability for us to gain expertise, the ability for us to be able to get funding will still exist. Even their companies will still have to go through the religious lobbying and their lobbying to ensure they can reduce as much funding as possible by lobbying to the politicians. And we think there's more of an incentive for corporations to ensure that there are as many lax regulations as possible to ensure that we can make as much money as possible. What did Ideal tell you? Ideal tells you that the qualifier the moment we make things exclusive is simple. The moment it's a public good and the government does it best, and we can ensure the mitigation of harm of everything else. What does this mean? This means the abilities for you to ensure that access to removal of HIV is a public good and accessible to everyone else. The ability for you to ensure that every aspect of government training and government research trickles down to people to ensure to keep the costs low. Governments already do this with utilities. Governments already do this all around the world with healthcare. We think we can do the same thing with genetic research and genetic editing. Yes.
This debate is not dichotomy. You can list out benefits of governments, and we are going to agree with you because a government can subsidize very good innovation by companies. Can you please explain to me why companies ought not to be involved at all, no matter how great they are, not just the Martin Skellies that we can remove also?
The governments, the corporations that you want to talk about are inherently focused on the abilities for them to lobby, inherently focused on the abilities for them to seek as much profit as possible. But not even that. These companies are also ones that will only enrich the CEOs and the board members. The comparative that Ideal told you, which they didn't respond to, was the fact that the money that does exist from these government sponsorships, from the abilities of us to make use of these patents and sell them or use their royalties out, is the ability for this money to go back to the people and ensure that the money goes back to the mandate that the people have chosen, that the people are able to get that value of transparency, unlike the corporations that they want to talk about. The ability was to question the profit margin and question the accountability of these corporations to ensure that anything that happens can never be concealed and they can always question everything else. The values of accountability that exists on your side of the house is lacking. Corporations can always find their ways around tax loopholes, just like Apple, basing their entire business in Ireland to ensure that they don't have to pay taxes in America, to ensure that, that they can always lobby these corporations that they can loosen their regulations. Apple and other companies like Amazon are able to make sure they don't have to face stringent worker ethics regulations because they're able to lobby them out, or because they're able to ensure that they stay within the monopoly or the oligarchy within the industries. This means any benefits you do want to have is always reactive and never one that is active. No, I told you no. This means that any harm that you do have on your side of the house, because speed is truly important and we agree, is always worse. That these short-term harms will always be horrible because these people will live their entire lives unable to live and change. Genetic editing must always start with using CRISPR, for example. Let's always start as an embryo. This means that for your first 20 years of these products being expensive, for your first 5 years, and for these products being like EpiPen, you have 5 years where the poor can never access HIV medications. We have 5 years where these children of the poor will always be worse off, where they will always be genetically worse, have horrible IQs, have horrible living conditions, just because they are unable to access the removal of harm that exists on the side of the house. It's not just that. The abilities for them to gain better livelihood and better genetics means the abilities for the rich to always have better access to these things, which means that the rich will always get in first. But even assuming the best case scenario, that these products get cheaper down the line, we tell you that the harm is already done. That the ability for these poor people to always do so will cascade in, so that even if you do have that 10 years, people have already died, the harm is now reversible. I'm sure I'll take your closing.
Aren't all the weaknesses of lobbying only indicating that the government is prone to bribery and therefore indicate a weakness in government itself? Because only weak governments in the United States are prone to easy lobbying, such as that in our.
Yes, exactly. While we do agree that is a harm, we tell you there is an incentive for the government to be questioned, to be attacked, and to be voted out. The abilities for these corporations, who are more often than not too large to fail, or corporations that control the majority or monopoly or an oligarchy, means the ability for them to have cartel-like behaviors to ensure that products are always expensive. Companies do this in America with banking and internet services. The abilities for them to always make sure that any benefits that does exist never goes back to the people, because corporations will always want to make sure that the board members and CEOs make the most money. Need to compare us to this. But even just that, the abilities for corporations to target and take down SMEs and patent troll means they remove access to other corporations or other SMEs to have access to these patents and access to these IPs. We told you, we are willing as government, everything. Governments has an incentive to ensure that these products are able to reach out to the lowest common denominator. Therefore, an incentive for the governments to ensure that these IPs are given out as cheap as possible so that everyone can have access to what is. These corporations that you want to talk about have no incentive to do so. These corporations have no incentive to ensure that any innovation goes down and trickles down. These corporations have no incentive to ensure that everyone has access to their talents and expertise, that everyone has access to the money that they have. Even if we tell you that these governments could be problematic and could be corrupt, at the very least, these governments still hold the mandate of the people. These governments can still be questioned. These governments can still principally do their jobs. Corporations never will.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister.
God. Okay. I'm going to do three things in this speech. I'm going to first assess what the burdens are in this debate, what the fear is in this debate, and what the alternatives exist on the opposition that don't require the government's model. The second thing I'm going to do is assess whether or not states can act independently, or if there is an inadequacy that they must be filled with cooperation. Because I want to know, we don't have to shit on states, because we can perfectly have them in our world. We just have to prove a coexistence is better than a world in which they existed independently. So the first thing, what are the burdens, fears, and alternatives in this debate? What is the burden? We think the opening government is insufficient in telling us, for example, that Martin Shkreli was an evil person who made an EpiPen for $5,000. We agree that it's true. There are a couple of things that we say are alternatives that don't require you excluding all corporations. For example, you can sue him for not releasing something that's a public good. There are mechanisms that currently exist. He was shamed by a huge amount of population because nobody found it accessible. Even the rich people thought it was ludicrous. He brought down prices and apologized for it. There exist some evil actors, but there isn't a necessity, and they haven't proven this necessity, to exclude artificially huge corporations, for example, that are investing in antiretroviral drugs, or investment in sickle cell anemia treatment. These things governments don't do, corporations do. Don't pin it on Martin Shkreli and say everyone is evil. So those are alternatives that exist that don't require the model of the opening government. Second, what is the fear in this debate? As him so blatantly and flippantly says, if you can fear regulations and suing, we can fear our less funding. No. The fear for regulations and suing is not related at all to fear on funding. You can fear the existence of funding. You can't fear the degree of that funding and the sustainability of it. Obviously, our regulations are also bound by corporate capture and other things. But a world in which regulation is captured by that is obviously less harmful if we have an unregulated company compared to an underfunded government, because you literally don't get any access to treatment and therapy. The worst and least regulated company might have worker abuse, might have some ability to patent troll, but the companies investing based on a corporate incentive. A lowly funded government literally has no innovation. That's why the fear is not symmetrical. That's why you can't just say we have funding, you have funding, everyone has funding. That's not how debates work. Given these things established, I'm going to first answer whether or not the states are more accountable alone, or are they better accountable with the involvement of a corporate influence. The first suggestion that opening government gives me is that they are beholden to a voter base. Yes, this is true. I just want to compare whether or not a voter base is sufficient enough to hold a government responsible. And the opening government suggests that they are election cycles. Look, if you don't deal with the characterization from Kelvin that people are either multi-issue voters who vote on many different incentives, and governments have to pick and choose which one they want to prioritize. Or second, when they are single-issue voters, genetic testing is often at the bottom of the rank. The people who have genetic diseases are busy in hospitals figuring out whether or not they can get treatment, are busy in private sectors operating on the very minimal efforts that they have. They are not a voting bloc in status quo. Black people are not a voting bloc in status quo. Sickle cell anemia patients clearly are not. So the opening government can't just say they are beholden to the same type of accountability. What's the comparative, however? Corporations, they are right to point out they are beholden to consumer base. This is direct. All the people that are buying medication from a corporation definitely want innovation in their medication, definitely care about those things over every other consideration that exists. If you don't have better innovative drugs, you're less likely to be able to get the market capture that is needed for your company to be a big thing. Therefore, we think on a comparison of whether voters are sufficient or whether you should include consumers who are directly involved, care about this thing over everything else, and are directly involved in the shared value of corporations. We think this is the more accountable structure compared to corporations. To which they say corporations are too big to fail. That is true. Here's the comparison of why a monopolized market is more accountable than a government structure. There are three reasons why. The first is a monopolized market, even though it exists as a monopoly, has an incentive to maintain the monopoly. And this incentive to maintain this monopoly is a constant one. It doesn't happen every 4 years like a government. It isn't beholden to different kinds of lobby, like the NRA, like religious organizations. If you don't put money into research, you don't put money into more accessible drugs, you will lose that monopoly. Therefore, we think on a comparison, the monopolization by corporations is far better than the monopolization that currently exists in government. All these just attempts to prove that the government is imperfect of an actor. Here are concessions that I will make. You are right, governments have a lot of ability to subsidize money because they can reallocate, assuming the best case scenario. If that is true, and indeed some drugs are inaccessible for the 5 years that we have a patent in the opening opposition, we are more than happy to support government subsidization because it can coexist with our. It just has to be to the benefit of a corporation existing. This is why we think we are more accountable. The second thing I'll talk about after this, I promise you, is innovation. Because the opening government so flippantly suggests that we don't have the ability to do this because of patent trolling. Okay, like the first thing I'll suggest is, even if there is patent trolling, that just means that corporations are incentivized to opt into this patent for a longer period, so they have time to increase the efficiency and the quality of those productions. And if patent trolling is preferable than a world in which governments don't even get the patent because they have so little investment in retaining what's the thing called, intelligent people and skilled people into their markets. They don't have the ability to fund public hospitals, let alone gene therapy. It's such a niche market. We did the comparison is companies with the huge ability to, for example, market internationally. They said governments will talk to other governments. Are you kidding me? We can't even decide on climate change protocol. You want governments to share patent information and sensitive information between each other. That doesn't exist in the status quo. Inside the alternative are corporations that are literally multi-existent. The developing world and the developed world can coexist with information. Like genetic makeup, the genetic makeup of people differ. Countries have incentives to care for this. Why would the Indian government share data with the United States? They are not being voted in by people in the United States. That's why we think innovation is better in our. Before I talk about access and why we think we will have cheaper, high-quality products. Closing.
And then, most of the time whenever government are involving themselves in research, most of the results of that research is open for public viewing, as no patenting is involved. Isn't that a better world?
Good lah. I mean, they can exist in our world too. We coupled with corporations. That's it. All right. The last thing I want to talk about is access. Opening government suggests it's 5 years. 5 years is too long for us to wait, even if it's down the line, people have died. If I can prove the comparison is shittier quality drugs or no drugs existing, then 5 years down the line seems pretty good. Right, what does the opening government have? They say they have access to really cheap medication. If you look at most parts of the governments that exist in the status quo, where medication is subpar, regulations on their own public sector are quite bad, we think it is often true that the ability to create high-scale innovation is tied to the quality of people that you have within the status quo or the research that you're willing to invest. In the opening opposition, there is no 5 years down the line. There is literally the low quality that currently exists, so you don't have incentive to continue upscaling. In this world, we would say there exists a current mechanism. What is this mechanism? Your patent exists for 5 years, then there are generic drugs that are made out of it. Companies copy to produce your product, then you increase. So yes, the rich get it first, but then once the rich don't get it, there's a new medication that supplements it, and then generic drugs become more and more accessible. These things, even if you don't believe this, and our drugs are expensive for the 5 years, for the 5 years governments get subsidized, then it becomes a market, something that's accessible in the market. So my point being, there are many ways to create access. You're all right, governments are great, but you have to prove in this debate why corporations are shit. If you don't, this debate has literally no end, because I'm not disagreeing with you. You have to disagree with me. Get that?
Thank you. We have to start with the closing afterwards.
Madam Chair, let me start this debate by having two ground rules to make this debate cleaner. Number one, this debate is specifically in regards to government owning research, not the outcome of research in terms of producing products later on. Which means in that world, corporations will still get access to that particular research because this research is open for public viewing, hence they are able to produce drugs at the end of the day. But I'm going to tell you why in this world, it's a better world in terms of how the prices of drugs will be controlled later on. But there are two things that we need to note in this debate. Their best case scenario is there's a free market of economy, which means corporations have full control over how they conduct research and also how they control the outcome of that particular pricing of the market. This is your best case scenario because you want to expedite research, and therefore companies have to have full control, there's no red tape barriers, and so on. In this world, several things will occur. Number one, due to the fact that they expedite research and pump a huge amount of money to the production of that particular drug, therefore, they're more likely to jack up the price at the early 5 years. Because Amrit is trying to use the word 5 years to mask the degree of harm that exists here. Patent doesn't last only for 5 years, it lasts for 30 years. And the reason why the distinction here is extremely important, because this involves a matter of life or death, and 30 years is literally how long a person has to wait. I don't think anyone, including by having a cancer or by having like malaria and so on, would be able to last that long. But second thing here is, assuming that another case that they want to point out to this debate. All right, guys, we will sue them. We will have laws in terms of regulation of price and so on. That would mean your world would have a lot of red tapes, which means you will slow down research. Therefore, all the benefits that you talk about by co-opting your regulation means your benefit is minimal or minuscule at its best. So you can't like extrapolate your benefit and live with that if you want to co-opt all of the red tape that you want to introduce. Now, before I move on to my argument proper, a few open rebuttals. Number one, Amrit argued, Kelvin mentioned some, specifically in regards to corporations are providing it for the interest of consumer as it best, and competitions are good in the pharmaceutical industry. The truth here is there are only several giants holding power. Pfizer, Zerastra, and so on are holding the market price and deciding the outcome of the particular drug, which means smaller corporations are being locked off in terms of producing either the products or even getting access to this particular research due to the amount of royalty that they have to pay for the patenting. The contrast here on our world here is when government own the particular research material and they're open for public viewing, we allow a few things to happen. Number one, since it's accessible to almost everyone, new market are able to emerge, new corporations are able to get access to this particular research material, hence provide and produce drugs. What will eventually result here is cheaper drug prices for the consumer at the end of the day. This will exist even in a world where you collaborate because of regulatory market capture, because Pfizer will try their best to lobby when they cooperate with the government. Hence why our model creates a separation of research altogether to avoid having monopoly or having control or regulatory capture in the market altogether. This is a unique and mutually exclusive benefit only on our side. But before I move on, any POIs? Yes.
So if government research is bound by political will, voters, what may have you, why not allow a corporation which is more proximal to the people who actually need it and are beholden to them?
All right, sit down. So under that logic, right, we wouldn't be having cancer drugs that locks a lot of people. Because if you view, the reason why people are able to afford drugs to begin with in a lot of countries is because government heavily subsidize them. It's not because consumers are demanding the company to lower the price. Literally, people are desperate and they have to beg the government to subsidize all of this. So consumer having the ability to regulate or control drug prices is also bullshit in today's debate. Let's move on to my argument proper. Why is it immoral for the state to allow private entity to own research of life-saving science? Because we need to understand that it is the state's moral imperative to ensure a quality of life for a citizen that is accessible for everyone. Because we need to clearly understand in what instances that the government can intervene and ensure that corporations need to adhere to certain basic principles. It is when it is at utmost priority and to ensure that people are not locked out from this particular access. What do we do in this particular instances? Government have the right to go and tell companies that you are not allowed to use certain chemicals in your particular product because it's dangerous for consumer. Although you're able to maximize profit in a particular instance, you are not being able to do so. We think it is immoral for company to keep on telling that guys, companies, you can produce drugs, but we will later on subsidize it, and so on. We think this is imperative and it is extremely dangerous for us to move along that particular tangent. But why is it why is our policy more sustainable in the long term in ensuring that people are actually interested? Several reasons. Number one, we think that people who are in the innovative world have natural incentive to go and conduct this particular research. That's why when you have the Manhattan projects and when you have the projects in Geneva, and for example, there are a large number of scientists volunteering to be a pioneer of that particular industry to begin with. So we want to tell you the important thing to take note here is it's a natural incentive for scientists to venture into particular producing results and greater outcome. So we don't need private corporations in this particular regards. The reason why we think we are able to cancel out the market altogether is because in a co-opting world, companies are usually be able to capture the best of the best and lock them up in their R&D departments in contrast to our world. That's why we want to suggest an full ownership of government altogether. Therefore, companies or scientists would most likely work in this particular government alone, and there's no companies out there to offer them bigger or higher wages, hence making government unable to get the best of the best talent in regards to genetic research and so on. So the comparative here is, in our world, that's why there's need to be a mutually exclusive ownership by the government for us to ensure that we get the best talent that wouldn't exist on their particular product. The conclusion of my arguments is twofold. Number one, I told you that open viewing of public material is how we lower down drug prices and we ensure newer markets are able to emerge and able to compete with the giants like Pfizer and Zoroaster and so on. But the second and most important reason is how do we capture the best talent. These are two unique extensions that was only exist on site closing, and that's why we think that we should take the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, member of government, member of opposition, please. You pass this. Is there one here?
If that walk from behind that means
I just know people get lost.
No, they're from APU, so it works.
Okay. Anyway.
Is you did it last after this?
Yes. Breaks and lunch.
We're gonna end at 10, aren't we?
Did you break your quarters?
Quarters.
Yeah.
We're gonna end at 9.
We're going at 10.
And they only 28 people to this government. They only 28 people to this government.
But it's training for growth, so we want to maximize the number of rounds of people. And I heard the red tree is really expensive, so.
It's needed.
It's so sad. Why don't you that?
Let's move it.
Well, actual training for worlds is next week, but the Mado one. Rating is training.
Majelis Debat Universiti
Go
Malaysia.
there so you did. Yeah. IIU does one every year for worlds.
Yeah, that one's more. I do.
Worlds is 50. 50. So
I think the last time we held it for like sources that were 500 was quite expensive.
it's 50.
Make sure you submit your feedback, please.
What we kind of can't for the past 2 rounds.
Really?
They're silent.
I mean, yeah, but for the views, right? I'm looking at the data. Missing some.
Oh, hi people watching. Hi.
It's recording, right?
It's still recording.
Shit, it was like 200. Y'all should come for NTU pre-worlds. Yeah, I don't promotion.
Yeah, I'm going.
Come to IIUTO, I guess.
I think why would you do that?
Come to BAC. Yes.
It's like first one.
What shake legs is it? That is BSc having the one.
No, that's study now.
Yes.
Okay, so
So what did this say? What did this say? Mundi. Upsell.
Because the labels are
I see.
Oh,
Ready? Ilka.
Ready? All right. Number of opposition, please.
I think in a world where we have a debate in which there is no certainty or guarantee in which actors are perfect, not all actors are perfect, I think it is very important to ensure that people have this ability to have choices. Which is why, for example, if the state is imperfect, then it means that people should have the ability to pursue other choices provided by the companies, Or also vice versa, if they believe that the companies are imperfect, then why we don't have this coexistence? Which means that we will have multi-accountability to hold each other responsible, to have better check and balances, to have better call-outs. Because I think in this kind of world, it's very important to be able to pursue different goals and outcomes, to be able to have healthy discussions and not controlled by state exclusively. Because it means that more people are able to discuss, for example, these independent scientists or the private companies, they're able to discuss, like for example, the ethicality or the morality of the research itself. Like for example, whether the designer baby is actually justifiable, or whether actually having research about super soldiers, no thank you letter, who don't have emotions, so they can be like a war machine and etc. is actually justifiable. Because if you can only have one actor, which is state, controlling the narrative, realize that it means state will be the only stakeholder who are able to control what are the outcomes of this research for the whole country, and I will give you analysis as to why this is very harmful. But before that, one point of rebuttal that doesn't quite fit. Number one, they worry so much. I think the whole government bench, in conclusion, they worry so much about the accessibility of the company's product itself. They are worrying about the patents, like for example, how people are not able to get these drugs in an affordable way. Number one, I think you need to consider that there is also a competition within the corporations itself, right? Like for example, if they see an opportunity, for example, because they see that this product is sold at a very expensive price, that's why, for example, another company might have another alternative to also do this kind of research. But note that due to this profit-oriented nature of these companies, I think it's more likely for them to be wanting to reach wider demographic, which is why it is more likely for them to actually lower down the price. Because you cannot keep the price at 5,000 forever, right? If you see that no people have the ability to purchase this, I think you would want more people buying your products at the end of the day. And therefore, even if it is not so, the government also, like I said before, due to the multi-accountability, the government is also able to call out this. But more importantly, public will be able to call out this, because like what you said, publications are available for them, publics actually have access to this kind of information. Before I move on to my extension, closing.
Okay, ma'am, if whatever you're saying is true in regards to its balanced market and so on, why must government heavily subsidize healthcare, and why healthcare are unapproachable or unaffordable for a lot of people?
I told you this is not exclusive. If you want government to subsidize these things, it's fine. But what I'm saying is that why government shall be the only stakeholder that is able to control the outcome of this. Because now I will move on to my own substantive points that CEO will bring to you today. I think even if our opening has told you about how the state is lacking of funding, for example, lacking of innovation, but I think there's something more to just that, right? I think what you need to consider is that state always have the incentive to also prioritize themselves. What do I mean by this? Even if the government is trying to tell you that, you know, state works for the people, you have to realize that, for example, in the 90s, there are secret projects made by the government. For example, the CIA secretly drugs people. Or like, for example, when people find out the government is secretly spying on the people for their own benefit, for example. Realize that the government has this incentive to always ensure the incumbent government to stay in power, which means that, for example, it is more likely for the state to be wanting, for example, to create soldiers, to modify the genes of the soldier, for example, so that they cannot feel emotions, for example, to create super army for the government itself. These are the things that are possible because it means that the government can control this narrative, and they have the ability to not have transparency to the people, because it means that since they have absolute control, they do not have to, like, for example, give responsibility to the people. They do not have to have this sort of accountability to the people, right? Compare this in contrast when we have multiple actors, like for example, private scientists or like scientists that are working for companies, actually striving together for the betterment of the people. It means that, for example, people will have the multi-accountability. And what do I mean by this? First level, right? Why state having exclusive control is very dangerous. Because like what I proved to you about the incentive of the state, they do not always prioritize the people. Like, for example, they are also prone to lobbying, prone to also protecting their own incentive and whatnot. It means that they will ensure the government in power. They will dictate what the scientists will have to pursue. If, for example, the scientists feel that this thing is more important to the people because it is more ethical, for example, but if the government feel that it puts too much people advantage and they cannot ensure their own goods, for example, the government will dictate the scientists to prioritize this thing, for example. And why is this dangerous? Because the second level analysis is that because scientists cannot live because they have no other option. If they find that they disagree with the ethicality of this research, they cannot opt out from this government job because they will have no other job since there are no jobs available if you ban the other companies for also doing their research, right? At the end of the day, the scientists will have to work for the government because they have no control, or like they cannot call out the government since there are no other private actors available for the scientists as a backup. That's why I believe that this is very, very dangerous. In comparative, if they are able to do these independent researchers, they have this freedom of option of what are the things that they want to explore, what are the things that needs to be prioritized by the people, because it is more accessible by the people. They have to provide this accountability to the people. Before 6 years.
So let me be sure, independent researcher under the government cannot do anything. But if I'm researching for a company, then I'm free to do whatever I want, no ROIs, no funding at all.
I told you, if there are multiple stakeholders, it means that, for example, if you disagree with these particular companies, you can opt out. You can actually say that this is not in line with my moral, for example. I prefer to do my own independent research, for example. I can seek out sponsor from another companies that is exclusive in our world when you have multiple stakeholders. But when tech is the only one controlling the narratives, what are the other options that the scientists have, right? I don't think that you have explained that at the first place. But also, right, scientists do not always consent to what the government will use of their research because the government are dictating the outcomes. It means that, for example, if at the first time you are researching for like a nuclear for radiology purposes to help people in their medical field, for example, but at the end of the day, the government feels that your research is can be utilized, for example, to develop nuclear bomb, for example, they can have this free control over the result of your research itself. This is very, very dangerous because it means that you do not actually consent of what the government will do of you. But if you're independently researching, it means that you can publicize this to the people, you can promote this to the people, so more people can actually support you. Given all this analysis, I do not see why the government should be the only actor.
Let's start with the scope.
Madam Chair, I don't think any of the benches from side opposition understand how expensive medicine really is or the outcome of the research is. Because a lot of individuals have to take out bank loans or mortgages in order to pay for their medical health care, take out EPF money. And one injection for chemotherapy costs about 100,000 ringgit in Malaysia, and we need 8. It's unfortunate that they think that corporations having a free market and having the free market to access a lot of research makes it a lot better for individuals, when in reality, this debate isn't about the outcome of that particular research, because corporations can still produce the amount of drugs at a cheaper price, which both sides eventually want. But the difference is that all these governments are the ones, the patent is locking out a lot of corporations from producing these cheaper drugs, and that is the structural problem that we're currently facing. So what am I going to do in my speech? And I'll take out CG first before I deal with CO first, right? The first question I'll answer is, how do we make things better in terms of the accessibility of those drugs? Because the thing that was never engaged in Amsha's speech was twofold. The first is that the research material in the world of closing government is out in the open. That means that companies can produce a lot of these drugs at a cheaper price. But the thing is that the ability for you to have knowledge or research regarding the drug is not accessible because a lot of big corporations have that particular access and have that particular patent in order to make those particular drugs. So all of these smaller corporations can never compete, which is why closing government's argument doesn't make sense, because their ability to have like multiple forms of accountability or co-opting the benefit will make it doesn't make sense, because there is no form of competition, because only one corporation dictates the ability for you to have control over that particular particular patent. And also, dealing with closing government here, if your characterization is true in regarding governments having horrible narratives, then you are only arguing for the sake of corporations having a narrative in terms of all forms of research. So that doesn't make any sense in this debate, right? So the first issue is, how do we make products a lot cheaper? The second thing that was never dealt in Amcha's speech is in regards to sustaining research and how do we get better scientists to produce better things within status quo, right? Because if you realize the reason why there is a monopoly in the market and the monopoly that Amrit wants is that people can't sustain that particular research. A lot of the talent and a lot of scientists currently in status quo go to companies that offer them a lot of better wages within status quo, right? It's extremely difficult for scientists to want to work in government sectors instead to develop the kind of research and quality research that you really want in that world, right? It happens, and this is exponentially slowed down in a world where you have a lot of co-opting because they have to go through strenuous regulations that make it difficult for your speedy process of wanting to get that particular information. So I think that those two things were never dealt in Amsha's speech, right? But just like engaging on what happens when this data is in the hand of corporations, the fact is that a lot of corporations hoard the kind of research that happens. It's just like an iPhone where they release the kind of drugs batch by batch or the kind of research and information with little modifications to ensure that there is always constant demand in the current climate, right? Or the fact that even if there are breakthroughs by these big corporations, the ability for people to have access to those breakthroughs are extremely low, and the ability is extremely slow within status quo, because at the point in which where that pattern runs out in 30 years, a lot of people would be dying in that world, right? I also think that when they talk about how states' incentive is political will, I think with corporations, a huge market existing is a form of political will, right? Because why wouldn't a corporation funnel into research that the people do not want within status quo? Because if it's something, and if the return of investment isn't good for them, they're just going to go into research other things that have less red tape within status quo. I don't understand why that's important in this debate, right? So I think that when they discuss about how states are subjected to religious lobbying and all those things, I think that the ability for corporations who are like completely immoral or don't have the same principles wouldn't really exist within that particular state because they wouldn't have a market there, right? I don't understand how that's a point in this debate. But let's just go on into other things. So the second question, why is it immoral for states to allow private entities to own that particular research? The first is because states have a vested interest to ensure a good quality of life or the ability to continue living. So the state ventures into a lot of policies to help individuals within status quo. So for example, cash handouts to the poor, food stamps, affordable healthcare. But in the aspect of research, we have things like price ceilings or safe foods to ensure that there are certain acts that exist in order to protect the safety within those particular drugs. Because all of these things are never going to be able to enforce in terms of the corporations. And even if regulations exist in your world, it slows down the ability for research to take place. So all of these, states have to constantly pump in money in order to subsidize the kind of medication that people get and to be able to get at least some form of access to that research by corporations before 6, yes.
So your religious lobby and your anti-intellectuals are the direct people who dictate the amount of funding that your research wing in government gets. Now, why do these people have any control over the R&D of a private company?
But you just said that a lot of people have the ability to control things when it comes to like voter base and stuff like that. So obviously they would have a role in terms of dictating what kind of research comes out from those corporations, right? If you say they have that much power in terms of wanting to vote things. So I don't understand like how that makes sense. But the second thing is, it is also immoral for the state to never learn from the past atrocities that happened before this. Because a lot of the diseases that happened prior to this, or a lot of diseases that existed, could never be resolved because corporations continuously made the drugs extremely expensive, right? So the pharmaceutical companies, and also the fact that a lot of pharmaceutical companies are emerging within status quo and becoming oligarchs and dictating the kind of prices that happen towards the research of those drugs and the outcome of those drugs. This increases numbers of corporations and makes competition a lot more harder within status quo, because like insofar as people are still being hurt by the fact that they don't have access to that research, or what happens when governments have the ability to have access to that research and then give it to other smaller companies in order to pump in cheaper drugs, I think that is a better alternative in the world of closing government. Because in their world, cancer treatment and malaria treatment will never be able to produce drugs unless it's in a period of time where they have have to wait for an extremely long period. The basic necessity of life or death is never sustained in the world of both closing government and also opening government, right? I think it's extremely difficult, considering that a number of people are being locked out of that medium, whether it be means by scientists who never a great pool of scientists who never delve into the development in terms of government research, or the fact that a lot of people are just disincentivized from going into that particular research because it just doesn't pay them enough unless they work within companies that are only like threefold that are existing within Cisco, that are big giants. I think because of those things, it's hard for the development of genetic research to take place productively, and I think that's why we take over all the teams in this debate.
Thank you. Finally, end the debate on social media.
Oh, you don't consent to it?
Yeah, there you go.
Ask your I mean, we'll just leave the call. It's the last speaker anyway, so we'll just leave the call.
Oh yeah. Yeah, yes, that.